So, I want to ground this deep dive by actually placing you inside a very specific, very modern space. Like, picture yourself standing inside the Louvre, Abu Dhabi.
Oh, okay. Starting in the 21st century for a 15th century topic. I like it.
Yeah, well, I just want you to picture the light in that space.
Mm.
Because the architect, Jean Nouvel, he engineered that staggering geometric dome to create this. He actually calls it a rain of light.
Right. It filters the harsh desert sun through, what is it, like 8 layers of overlapping steel and aluminum stars?
Exactly. And you stand under that canopy, and the intricate shifting shadows fall across, ancient sarcophagi, mummy wrappings, classical sculptures.
It's a space deliberately constructed to make you hyper-aware of human vision, really.
Yes, exactly. It makes you aware of how we have continually tried to engineer our environment to basically visualize our place in the cosmos.
I mean, Nouvel's design forces a physical confrontation with the infinite. The architecture itself is the mechanism for contemplating the divine.
Which is a huge theme for us today.
Yeah, it's a common thread in monumental structures across human history. You aren't just looking at artifacts there. The building is actively manipulating your sensory input to induce a specific philosophical state.
And that manipulation of sensory input is exactly our focal point for this deep dive. Because to truly unpack this absolute paradigm shift in how humanity visualizes the infinite and, frankly, its own terrifying mortality, we have to leave the glittering shores of Abu Dhabi.
Right, we are stripping away the modern steel in the sunlight.
We are. We are moving to the cavernous, shadow-filled nave of the Santa Maria Novella church in early 15th century Florence, Italy.
Oh, the transition from the exterior world into that specific Dominican space is jarring. I mean, it's visceral.
Paint that picture for us. What is that like?
Well, in the 1420s, you would be walking out of a sunlit, cloistered graveyard, basically, and then you step through these heavy wooden doors into a space dominated by Gothic verticality and just heavy, heavy shadow.
So your eyes are literally struggling to adjust.
Exactly. The lighting conditions alone dictated a physical recalibration of the eye. It takes a minute for you to even process what's in front of you.
And what is in front of you is what we're dissecting today. Masaccio's The Holy Trinity, painted roughly between 1425 and 1427.
A truly monumental piece of work.
It is. This 22-foot-tall fresco is honestly a cornerstone of human visual history, and the mission for our deep dive today is to really explore the user experience of the 15th century.
I love that phrasing, the user experience.
Yeah, because we are looking at how a two-dimensional, completely flat plaster wall was mathematically and chemically engineered to hack the human retina and the human mind.
The term hack is incredibly appropriate here because Masaccio weaponized the emerging science of optics to override the viewer's physical reality.
He weaponized it. That's a great way to put it.
He really did. The wall in Santa Maria Novella basically ceased to function as a solid boundary and became this terrifying yet deeply hopeful spatial void.
And to understand the mechanics of that void, we have to consider the physical posture of the 15th century viewer. Right? Like encountering it for the very first time.
Absolutely.
So put yourself in the shoes of a Florentine citizen walking into that nave. Your eyes adjust to the dim, beeswax-scented air.
You're taking in the scale of the place.
Right. You look across the massive expanse of the church, and this staggering illusion completely commands your peripheral and central vision. Because it isn't a framed painting hanging politely on a hook.
Not at all. It's a 22-foot architectural intervention. It completely dwarfs you.
So the scale dictates the psychological relationship from the jump.
Exactly. By painting the fresco at nearly 22 feet in height, Masaccio forces the viewer into a subordinate physical posture. You are looking up.
You feel tiny.
You do.
Yeah.
You are physically overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the illusion before you even begin to process the theological narrative occurring within it.
And that actually brings up a mechanical question about the space that I've always wondered about. Because this fresco has a pretty brutal history, doesn't it?
Oh, it really does.
Like, it was covered by a stone altar by Vasari in the 16th century, and then rediscovered in the 19th century, detached from the wall, moved, and then moved back in the 20th century.
It's been through a lot.
So with all that displacement, I just struggle to believe that a modern viewer standing in Santa Maria Novella is experiencing the exact same optical assault as someone in 1425. Like, doesn't the removal and reinstallation shatter the delicate calibration of the illusion?
You would think so, right? The restoration history is violent, but the spatial integrity remains surprisingly intact.
Wait, really? How is that possible?
It's because of the architectural constraints of the nave itself. See, the physical doorway you would pass through from the exterior aisle aligns your line of sight perfectly with the central axis of the fresco.
Oh, so the building forces you into the right spot.
Exactly. Masaccio calculated the perspective assuming the viewer would approach from that specific vector. So even with the slight alterations in its mounting over the centuries, occupying that specific floor space triggers the optical illusion exactly as the geometry intended.
The math holds the space together.
The math holds it together.
Yes, it's seriously like a 15th century VR headset. You step onto that specific stone paver, the perspective locks in, and your brain completely overrides your physical reality.
That's a perfect analogy.
Because you logically know you're looking at a flat layer of painted lime plaster, right? But your neurological processing violently insists that you are looking into a deep, receding, three-dimensional chapel.
And that cognitive dissonance you are describing, that is the defining characteristic of the Florentine Renaissance.
Let's clarify that term, actually.
Yeah,
Because we throw Renaissance around a lot.
we do.
Yeah.
But here we are talking about the aggressive, methodical revival of classical antiquity. It's a literal rebirth.
Right, not just a generic cultural flourishing, but specifically ancient Greece and Rome.
Exactly. Masaccio isn't just creating a sense of depth. He is actively pulling the architectural vocabulary of ancient Rome out of the ruins and projecting it onto a flat wall in a Gothic church.
Let's dissect that architecture, because it really is the framework of the entire illusion. Masaccio paints a massive Roman triumphal arch.
It's imposing.
Yeah, he uses these fluted pilasters with intricate Corinthian capitals on the outer edges to frame the exterior. And then stepping inward, he uses smooth, unfluted columns with Ionic capitals to support the interior structure.
And the juxtaposition of those specific classical orders, the Corinthian on the exterior pilasters and the Ionic on the interior columns, that is not merely decorative.
It means something structurally.
It demonstrates a highly sophisticated understanding of Roman architectural syntax that had been completely absent from European painting for, a millennium.
Wow, 1,000 years.
Yeah, Masaccio is applying the structural logic of antiquity. The pilasters imply the structural load-bearing capacity of the wall, while the smooth columns draw the eye inward. It establishes a hierarchy of space.
And that inward pull is magnified by the ceiling, because those Ionic columns are supporting a massive, deeply recessed, coffered barrel vault.
The barrel vault is everything here.
It's the geometry of those sunken square panels curving upward and backward into the dark void that really breaks the brain.
It's so convincing.
It reminds me of those modern Trompe-l'oeil street artists, the ones who paint a gaping sinkhole on a flat sidewalk.
Oh, yeah, where people walk around it.
Exactly. Your brain knows the concrete is flat, but your stomach drops anyway, and you instinctively step around the drawing. Masaccio is inducing that exact physiological vertigo just on a vertical plane.
Right. And the barrel vault is the engine of that spatial illusion. The coffering, those sunken squares you mentioned, they provide the brain with repetitive geometric units that decrease in size as they recede.
So it's basically a scaling trick.
Exactly. It exploits the basic principles of visual scaling. By meticulously calculating the precise rate at which those squares shrink, Masaccio manufactures a terrifyingly convincing depth. The solid plaster literally dissolves.
The geometry creates the void, sure, but the theology is what fills it with dread and hope.
Oh, absolutely.
We have to examine what is actually occupying this manufactured architecture, because Masaccio places the Gnadschul, the throne of mercy, directly inside that vaulted space.
A very specific theological arrangement.
Yeah, we have God the Father standing at the back. The Holy Spirit is a white dove hovering near his collar, and Christ on the crucifix suspended below them.
And the Gnadschul was a known typological structure, but rendering it with this level of spatial coherence was unprecedented.
Because it places the infinite in a finite space.
Exactly. Masaccio forces an impossible theological paradox into a rational, measurable space. You have the infinite, boundless nature of God the Father confined within the specific, mathematically precise architecture of a Roman vault.
It creates a palpable tension. The boundless is suddenly bound.
And it visualizes the ultimate duality. The throne represents absolute divine judgment, the terrifying authority of the Creator.
But occupying the exact same vertical axis is the mechanism of grace, the crucified Christ.
Right. It visually tells the viewer that mortal salvation requires passing directly through that judgment via the physical sacrifice of the Son. The judgment and the mercy are inseparable here.
And that vertical axis is flanked by the supporting cast, who really serve to ground the abstract theology in, recognizable human emotion.
They are our emotional anchor.
Yeah, inside the archway, we find St. John the Evangelist on the right and the Virgin Mary on the left. And St. John's posture, his hands are clasped, he's locked in this internal agonizing contemplation. It perfectly represents the expected human grief.
He is the model of mourning for the viewer.
Right. But I struggle with Mary's positioning here.
Really? How so?
Well, if she is the mother witnessing the brutal execution of her son, why is she so completely detached from the physical reality of his suffering?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Like in Giotto's earlier works, the grief is visceral, right? Angels are literally tearing their hair out, faces are contorted in agony. But here, Christ is agonizing on the cross right next to her, and she is just staring straight out into the nave.
It's a very different vibe.
Yeah. She raises her right hand and gestures toward him like she is delivering a stoic boardroom presentation on salvation. Isn't that an emotional step backward just for the sake of a theological point?
I wouldn't call it a regression. It is actually a profound philosophical shift influenced by the Neoplatonic thought that was just permeating Florence at the time.
Okay, so it's intentional stoicism.
Extremely intentional. Mary's stoicism elevates her from a grieving historical mother to an eternal theological mechanism. She is the intercessor.
She breaks the fourth wall.
Exactly. By making direct eye contact with the viewer, she collapses the temporal distance between 1425 Florence and the actual crucifixion. Her gaze acts as a physical tether.
So she's pulling the viewer out of the mundane space of the nave and into the mechanism of salvation.
Right. She is the interface. She bridges the gap between the flawed, mortal reality of the viewer standing on the floor and the perfect eternal reality of the Trinity inside the vault.
And Masaccio explicitly maps out that boundary between the mortal and the divine through the placement of the patrons, doesn't he?
He does. It's a brilliant spatial choice. The patrons, Domenico Lenzi and his wife, are situated just outside the classical columns.
Right on the edge.
Literally. They rest on a painted ledge that appears to project outward into the viewer's space. They are physically excluded from the sacred interior of the barrel vault, existing on this liminal threshold.
And Domenico Lenzi is depicted in the heavy red robes of a high-ranking Florentine official, which is a fascinating, specific socioeconomic context.
Yeah, Florence in the 1420s was wild.
It was a powder keg. You've got political maneuvering, immense wealth from the wool trade, and the constant looming threat of plague and warfare with Milan.
Right, so buying space on the wall of Santa Maria Novella wasn't just an act of piety.
It was a highly calculated socio-political flex.
It was the ultimate intersection of civic identity and spiritual insurance.
Spiritual insurance, I love that.
It's true, though. The Lenzi family is asserting their dominance in the Florentine hierarchy while simultaneously securing a perpetual visual prayer for their souls.
But notice their psychological posture compared to Mary, because Mary breaks the fourth wall to engage the viewer. But the Lenzi patrons do not look at us, nor do they look at the divine figures.
They are completely locked in.
Yeah, they are in sharp profile, steering straight ahead in this rigid, pious meditation.
And they are completely unidealized. You can see the harsh lines of Domenico's face, the specific slope of his nose.
They look like violently real people frozen in this liminal space.
Yes, and their placement creates this sort of ladder of reality.
A ladder of reality.
Yeah, think about it. You have the messy, transient reality of the viewer on the church floor. Then you move up to the ledge where the mortal patrons exist in a state of perpetual, suspended devotion.
Okay, I see.
And then finally, you pass the threshold of the columns into the eternal mathematical perfection of the divine.
But that spatial mapping of the spiritual hierarchy is entirely dependent on the foundational technology of this fresco, which is single-point linear perspective.
Absolutely. The theological ladder you described only functions because Masaccio deployed a mathematical system to organize human perception.
We have to dive into the absolute granular mechanics of this math, because it is basically the source code of the entire illusion.
It really is.
Single-point linear perspective wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a rediscovered science. Filippo Brunelleschi figured out the geometry just a few years prior, and Masaccio basically took that raw theoretical physics and plastered it onto a 22-foot wall.
Right, and Brunelleschi's discovery was rooted in his intense study of optics and geometry, which was heavily influenced by the translation of Arabic treatises, specifically the work of Al-Hazen.
Who completely revolutionized the understanding of how light enters the eye, right?
Exactly. Brunelleschi realized that parallel lines, as they recede from the viewer, appear to converge at a single point on the horizon.
And he proved this with that famous mirror experiment.
Yeah, the Florence Baptistry experiment. He painted a panel, forced the viewer to look through a drilled hole, and held up a mirror to align the painted perspective with the physical building.
So he effectively mapped the behavior of light rays onto a two-dimensional grid.
Precisely. And later, Leon Battista Alberti codified this entirely in his treatise De Pictura.
Right.
Alberti's concept of the painting as an open window through which the viewer looks into a constructed reality became the defining dogma of Western art for centuries.
The theoretical math in a manuscript is one thing.
Yeah.
How did Masaccio physically execute this algorithm on wet plaster? I mean, that sounds impossible.
The physical execution required grueling labor and immense speed. Masaccio was working in buon fresco, which means painting directly onto wet lime plaster.
And the clock is ticking the second it goes on the wall.
Oh, yeah. The chemical reality of this medium is that as the plaster dries, it reacts with the carbon dioxide in the air to form calcium carbonate. The pigment becomes physically locked into the crystalline structure of the wall.
So you have a tiny window of time before the wall literally turns back into limestone. You can't just casually sketch out a perfect grid and tweak it over a few weeks.
Exactly the opposite. You have to work in jornate or a day's work.
A day's work, right.
You apply only as much wet intonaco plaster as you can paint before it cures. So Masaccio had to transfer this complex mathematical grid onto the wall piece by piece, day by day, without losing the structural integrity of the overarching geometry.
That is mind-blowing.
And to achieve the perspective, he actually drove a physical nail directly into the plaster at the vanishing point.
Wait, an actual physical nail?
Yeah, a literal iron nail right into the wall.
That is the anchor.
Mm-hmm.
And the vanishing point is situated perfectly on the ledge where the lensi donors are kneeling, which is, what, roughly 5.5 feet off the floor.
Yes, calculated to hit the exact eye level of an average 15th century Florentine standing in the nave.
He drove a nail into the wall right at their retinas.
That's a great way to visualize it. From that nail, he attached chalked strings.
Okay, truck strings.
By pulling those strings taut across the wet plaster and snapping them, he created the orthogonals.
The diagonal lines.
Right, the diagonal lines radiating outward that form the grid of the barrel vault. If you examine the fresco under raking light today, you can actually still see the physical grooves in the plaster left by those strings.
That is insane. The mathematics wasn't abstract. It was a physical web violently snapped into the architecture of the church.
It's very physical, very tactile.
So the orthogonals are basically the visual tractor beams pulling your eye into the void, and they all converge on that single nail hole at your eye level.
Exactly.
And intersecting that vanishing point is the horizon line, defined by the bottom edge of the step where the patrons kneel. It cleanly severs the viewer's physical space from the painted celestial space.
It's a brilliant boundary, but the geometry constructs a flawless void, but geometry alone is sterile.
But it's just lines.
Exactly. An architect's blueprint, no matter how precise, does not evoke profound theological dread. For the Holy Trinity to succeed as a visual weapon, Masaccio had to populate that mathematical void with brutal, heavy, physical mass.
And that requires looking back a century before Brunelleschi's math, right, to the early 14th century and the massive influence of Giotto.
Yes, Giotto is the key here.
Because Giotto shattered the Byzantine tradition of painting figures as these weightless, floating two-dimensional symbols against gold backgrounds.
Right. The Byzantine style was concerned with the spiritual essence, basically totally ignoring earthly physics.
But Giotto introduced an empirical understanding of mass through chiaroscuro, the manipulation of light and dark.
He recognized that objects in space obstruct light, creating shadows that define volume. By modeling his figures with heavy directional lighting, Giotto gave them gravitational weight.
They stopped floating.
They stopped floating and began to displace space.
So Masaccio takes Giotto's gravitational weight and forces it inside Brunelleschi's perspective grid. It is the perfect synthesis of mass and math.
It really is.
Like you look at the body of Christ suspended in that barrel vault, and it is a masterclass in anatomy and physics. This is not a symbolic rendering of a deity. This is a heavy, sagging, dying human body.
The physical tension is palpable. Look at the way Christ's arms are stretched, bearing the immense downward pull of his own torso. The abdomen sags realistically.
It's almost hard to look at.
Masaccio paints the collarbones and the rib cage responding to the sheer mechanics of hanging from a crossbeam. And the light source illuminating Christ perfectly matches the actual physical light source entering the church from the windows in the nave.
Oh, wow. so it further locks the illusion into the viewer's reality.
Exactly.
That synthesis of the heavy, suffering flesh inside the cold, perfect architecture, it creates this overwhelming emotional friction. You feel the physical agony of the human form trapped within the eternal, immutable geometry of the divine.
It's deeply unsettling.
And that friction, that confrontation with physical reality, leads directly to the final, devastating reveal of the fresco.
Yes, because the composition relentlessly drives the viewer toward a confrontation with mortality. The vanishing point anchors your eye level on the patrons, but the architecture of the wall itself extends downward.
Below the illusionistic floor of the chapel.
Right, into the lowest register of the fresco.
Which is painted just inches above the actual stone floor of the church. And it's an open, illusionistic sarcophagus. Inside rests this snark, anatomically hyper-realistic skeleton.
This is the Memento Mori, a brutal visual mechanism designed to shatter any remaining illusion of earthly permanence.
Especially in a city repeatedly ravaged by the Black Death.
Right. With endemic outbreaks of plague, a skeleton wasn't an abstract philosophical concept. It was an acute daily reality. Masaccio rendered the bone structure with the same unforgiving empirical observation that he applied to the architecture.
It grounds the entire lofty theological hierarchy in the absolute rot of the grave. And to ensure the message wasn't lost in the sheer visual spectacle, Masaccio actually carved a haunting Italian inscription into the painted wall directly above the skeleton.
I was once what you are, and what I am, you also will be.
I was once what you are. You, the viewer, standing in the church, clothed in flesh, breathing the damp air, maybe entangled in the political and economic web of Florence.
And what I am, you also will be. Reduced to bone, stripped of identity, wealth, and power.
It forces an immediate visceral recognition of the viewer's own decay.
It is an aggressive, hostile piece of text to encounter. You walk into a space seeking spiritual comfort, and a 22-foot wall tells you that you are essentially a walk-in corpse.
But analyzing the complete spatial logic of the fresco reveals that the skeleton is actually the catalyst, not the conclusion.
Oh, definitely.
It's the starting block for the psychological user journey Masaccio designed.
Because the physiological instinct upon reading a terrifying message is to look up, to seek an escape from the threat.
Right, flight response.
Masaccio counted on that optical reflex. You start at the floor, reading the inscription, confronted by the inevitability of the tomb.
And then, driven by the dread of that memento mori, your eyes instinctively travel upward. You bypass the grave and immediately encounter Domenico Lenzi and his wife on the ledge.
You see the mortal patrons modeling the solution to the terror of death.
Stoic, pious devotion. They demonstrate the requisite posture of the faithful.
And following the vertical axis, your gaze moves past the threshold of the classical columns and into the divine space. You meet the outward, intercessory gaze of the Virgin Mary.
She acknowledges your presence, your mortality, and your adherence to the patron's model of prayer, and she physically points your attention inward and upward.
You follow her hand, drawn deeper into the geometric void by the pull of those orthogonals, and you arrive at the apex.
You witness the heavy, physical sacrifice of Christ, and towering above him, the infinite presence of God the Father holding the cross.
You have moved from the terrifying reality of physical rot at the bottom, step by step, into the rational, mathematically perfect promise of eternal salvation at the top.
It really is a complete, self-contained diagram of the universe.
That's the best way to describe it.
He synthesized the architectural vocabulary of Roman antiquity, the rigorous optical geometry of Brunelleschi, the raw anatomical mass of Giotto, and the Neoplatonic theology of early humanism into a single, cohesive interface.
It is an artwork that successfully rewired the cognitive processing of the 15th century mind.
He proved that a flat surface, if engineered with enough mathematical and psychological precision, can completely manipulate human perception. It can dictate how a person conceptualizes their physical body, their inevitable death, and their exact coordinates in the universe.
The linear perspective deployed in Santa Maria Novella was the absolute bleeding-edge spatial technology of 1425. I mean, it dictated the parameters of visual truth for the next 500 years.
Which honestly forces a deeply uncomfortable question for us right now.
Oh.
Yeah. If a painted arrangement of mathematically calculated chalk lines, driven nails, and shaded lime plaster could fundamentally rewrite how an entire civilization perceived reality and its own mortality.
Right.
What modern spatial technologies, algorithmic feeds, and augmented interfaces are currently rewriting your perception of the world today without you even realizing the grid has been drawn.
The tools of the illusion have evolved, for sure.
But the vulnerability of the human retina remains exactly the same. Until next time, keep looking deeper.